Hi and welcome to Terry Talks Movies. This time around, as you can see from the thumbnail, I'm going to be reviewing the new A24 movie Heretic, starring Hugh Grant in a somewhat unusual role for Hugh Grant. In case you haven't seen it, there is the poster for it. And there is the back of the poster for it. But I'm also going to be reviewing 3 other things that I've seen lately that are kind of interesting. 2 of them I'm not the demographic for whom the movies are aimed at. I like them anyway. And the other one is a classic from the 1940s, which has a little bit to say about contemporary situations. So we'll get started with the 2 movies that I am definitely not the target audience for. Nonetheless, I found them interesting. I found that they had something to say that I was interested in hearing. The first one's a 2024 science fiction movie, which stars Maisie Stella and Aubrey Plaza. It's got an unusual title. The title is My Old Ass, or Ass, I suppose, in proper terminology. It was written and directed by Megan Park, and it's the story of a character called Elliot, who is going on a camping trip with her best friends. She's got 2 female best friends. The family is waiting for her at home after they go camping to throw her an 18th birthday party. Before they go off camping, she meets a girl called Chelsea that she's been flirting with for a while, and they have sex, and then Elliot goes off on this camping trip with her friends. And they all take shrooms, hallucinogenic mushrooms. Haven't done them myself. One of the few things I haven't done. They take those, their friends start having wild trips. But Elliot has a particularly weird experience because Elliot says, this isn't having an effect on me. The mushrooms are not working. Then she turns around and there's an older woman sitting next to her, about 20 years older than Elliot is. And this woman, played by Aubrey Plaza, tells Elliot that she is Elliot's older self. And she's come from the future for reasons neither of them know about. And her and Elliot start talking about life and the future. Older Elliot doesn't particularly want to do spoilers on the life of her younger self, but they bond. They start talking. The dialogue's really crisp and fun and silly and interesting, and the 2 actresses really do a good job of playing off each other. And the 39-year-old Elliot says that she's a PhD student, and Elliot's shocked that older Elliot is still going to university. And younger Elliot, because she's a bit lost with her life, she doesn't quite know where she wants to go or who she wants to be, starts asking for advice. And older Elliot tries to give her some advice that isn't going to be a spoiler for the life of her younger self. She suggests bonding with her family and spending time with each of them and putting aside her own little grievances and just doing things with her family, which she ends up doing. Older Elliot gives her a weird piece of advice saying, avoid anybody called Chad. And they go, okay, and they go into the tent and they fall asleep. Older Elliot disappears for the time. And so Elliot wakes up, she goes back, has her 18th birthday party, continues her affair with Chelsea and all that kind of thing, and starts getting text messages and phone calls from her older self. And neither of them know how this stuff works. They just know that it works. And Elliot's family run a cranberry bog at its harvest season, and they hired somebody to help them harvest the cranberries. By the way, I found out today, cranberries aren't actually berries. They're actually nuts. So basically, they're swamp peanuts, which is kind of weird. But anyway, the guy her family hires to work in the cranberry bog with them, his name is Chad. And he's kind of polite and cute and respectful. And Elliot finds herself increasingly attracted to Chad. And she's worried because her older self has told her to avoid anyone called Chad. But nonetheless, even though she thought she was gay, as her attraction to Chad increases, she finds out she might be bisexual. And indeed, it turns out that she finds out she's bisexual and her attraction to Chad increases. Now, I'm not going to go into spoilers beyond that. There's a whole arc after that, which is really interesting. And the rapport between Aubrey Plaza and Maisie Stella is good. They play off each other nicely as the older and younger versions of the same character. And it's quite a touching movie. It works really well. It lands the premise fantastically. It's a coming-of-age movie with a beautiful twist, and it's held together by both the script and the acting. Beautiful locations as well. Like I said, I'm not the target demographic for this kind of movie, but I enjoyed it. I couldn't see where it was going, but I was there for the journey once the journey started on the film. And I'd heard a lot of things on social media about how good it is, and it's a recommend from me. Now, most of my audience here is definitely not the demographic for this film. But if you're willing to step outside the box and just go for a story which has got a science fictional premise, but is actually a good piece of storytelling, about coming of age, which is something, if you put aside your own preconceptions, everybody can relate to a coming of age story. We've all had to deal with growing up at some stage. You can argue that certain groups of men on social media never do that, but for the most of us, we do at some stage come of age and grow up and become adults of some sort. So you can identify with it to that extent. It's nicely done, it's beautifully shot, and it's heartwarming. Most of the movies I watch, as you can see if you look at my letterboxd, are not particularly heartwarming movies, but I like them now and then. It's a palate cleanser for me to see a movie that is about human connection and about human relationships, and doesn't use it as an excuse to go off on a gunfight. So this one's a nice recommend for me, but as I said before, it's not for everybody. But if you want to give it a go, I think you'll have a good time with it.
I know this might sound crazy. I don't want to alarm you. Do you remember a TV show we used to watch together? It was called
The Pig of Eight?
Next cab off the rank, I'm definitely not the target for. It's a kind of science fiction, psychological horror movie-ish kind of thing. It's a bit hard to define the genre of this one. It's a metaphor for the experience of finding out that you're trans and going through the process of the changes in your life and in the way you see yourself for being trans. And it's a movie called I Saw the TV Glow, which was written and directed by Jane Schoenbrunn, who is a trans woman. Main actors are either non-binary or queer in some way. And it stars Justice Smith and Bridget Lundy Payne as a couple of people, and we see them from teenage years through to their adult life, who become obsessed with the TV show. The movie starts in 1996, and teenager Owen and Maddie bond over a kind of young adult TV show called The Pink Opaque, which follows teenagers Isabel and Tara as they use their psychic connection to fight a supervillain called Mr. Melancholy. And it's a weird kind of thing. It's almost like a cross between Power Rangers and Twin Peaks for young people. And for Owen, it's a difficult thing because for him, the show is on after his bedtime and his parents won't let him watch it. And so he sometimes sneaks out and goes to Maddie's place to watch the show. And then later on, Maddie burns tapes for him of the show so he can watch them in the school multimedia lab. So they bond over this, and so they do this for a couple of years. The series runs for 5 seasons. Increasingly, it becomes apparent to Owen, who's as obsessed with this show as Maddie is, that Maddie is relating to it at a very deep level. And they're watching an episode and she cries, and Owen finds out that she has an abusive stepfather, and eventually she disappears from town and leaves. And in the backyard of her house, when she leaves, is a burning television set. Now time passes and Owen grows up. His father dies, his mother dies. He starts working in a cinema and reconnects with Maddie decades later. And Maddie claims to have lived for a time as one of the characters in the world of that TV show. It's fantastically shot. There's lots of pastel colors in it. And it is about people who are undergoing the trans experience. There's a phenomenon for trans people called the egg crack. The moment you realize that the gender you're assigned at birth is not the gender you have. And it's a profoundly impactful moment for trans people. And the whole movie is about that. And I've had to do a bit of research to understand this movie. It's not an easy watch for a cis-het male like myself to totally understand the metaphor without a little bit of an additional help. But I think it's a good movie. It really is striking. It's about somebody else's life experience, a life experience that I have only marginal knowledge of. I've had trans friends for decades. I know that people fight it very hard. I know that there's a lot of discrimination against trans people. It's like that old joke, a racist, a sexist, and a transphobe walk into a bar, and the bartender says, "Didn't you write Harry Potter?" I Saw the TV Glow. It's a fascinating film. It's a very accomplished film. It's made really, really well. It lands the premise and the plot. There's a strangeness and an otherworldliness to it that I found fascinating. Even though at the start I was going, what's this movie about? What's happening here? It drew me in. and I started liking the characters, particularly Owen. Justice Smith does a really good job of playing a very, very troubled character over several decades of his life. That kind of small town American environment has always been creepy to me. I mean, it's been in Twin Peaks, it's been a whole bunch of other movies and TV shows with profoundly disturbing themes. And the creepiness is used to great effect in this film. And like I said, it's not for everybody, and you may not be the target audience for it. In fact, some people who are watching this are. Some of my subscribers are LGBTQIA plus people, and hi to them. But for some of you, it's not going to work. But I think if you want to go outside your comfort zone, and I've always recommended on this channel that people do, walk on the wild side now and then and just see what else is out there beyond the stuff that makes you wriggle in your tummy button. And I think you'll find it a rewarding film. So that's the second recommendation I've got for you. The third one is going to be one that doesn't require any learning curve for most people. It's a 1942 MGM black and white film starring Spencer Tracy and Katharine Hepburn in it. And it's got some important political themes in it. It's a film called Keeper of the Flame, which is directed by George Cukor. And the theme of this video seems to be LGBTQIA plus people, because George Cukor himself was a gentleman who preferred gentlemen. And the movie script, written by Donald Ogden Stewart, was based on a novel by a writer called I.A.R. Wiley, who was actually a woman called Ida Wiley, born here in Australia, born in Melbourne, but who lived most of her life in England and America, who was herself a lesbian. So there's a lot of rainbow stuff in this video. This movie didn't make a lot of money, and in fact, it is the movie that George Cukor didn't like most out of the movies he made. In it, Katharine Hepburn plays the widow of a famous civil leader called Forrester, who's died during a storm. He's crashed his car, a bridge broke on his property. The car crashed into a ravine, he died. The death of Forrester, who's a great big civic leader, puts the whole nation in mourning. Military leaders, political leaders go to the town where he died. There are a lot of media there, a lot of journalists, tons of people. People line the sides of the streets. It's basically a cult following for this civic leader who has meant so much to so many people. He's made speeches. He was a World War I hero. It's 1942. A journalist called Steve O'Malley returns from Europe to cover the funeral of this Forrester guy. He's played by Spencer Tracy. And O'Malley has spent a number of years in Europe following and reporting on the rise of Nazism until finally the Germans threw him out and he came back to America. And he wants to write a biography of Forrester, just outlining what a great American man he is. The family have a big estate in the country there. They're the kind of lords of the manor of the local area. And O'Malley finds his way onto the property. So I was talking to Christine Forrest, who's very evasive about things. There is a secretary, a male secretary of Forrest's, who tries to give O'Malley lots of information, copies of speeches, audio recordings of the speeches, lots of information about Forrest and his life to try to help him. But O'Malley wants to get to the people part of it. And he starts finding out that things aren't quite what they seem. He talks to the gatekeeper of the estate, played by Howard Da Silva. He talks to a loquacious local cab driver, played by Percy Kilbride, who was in the Mara and Park Kettle movies. And he talks to a number of other people and starts finding out that things are slightly off. Now, I'm going to give you the spoiler on this one because I think it's an important movie to see. There's an old bunker on the property called the Arsenal. Christine keeps going there to burn something in the fireplace at the Arsenal. And Steve eventually gets in there and she reveals to him that Forrest was going to be part of a fascist takeover of America. He was financed by millionaires. At the time it was millionaires, nowadays it'd be billionaires. And they had a very detailed plan on how to take over America and make America strong in the same way that Nazi Germany was strong. Forrest, when he died, was on his way to brief a whole bunch of saboteurs who were going to destroy some infrastructure to make that takeover easier. Forrest had built himself a kind of Hitler Youth of American youth and an organization which is not entirely unlike MAGA to help with this fascist takeover of America. And Christine found out about this and didn't tell him that the bridge was being washed out, so that he died. Now, this is a fascinating movie. Mostly it's fascinating not only for the theme and for the way the great American man is shown to be a great American monster, but it was a crazily controversial movie at the time. It was screened for the Office of War Information's Bureau of Motion Pictures in 1942, a year after Pearl Harbor, where it was disapproved of by the Bureau's chief, a guy called Lowell Mellett. Louis B. Mayer saw it at the premiere and stormed out of the film, was pissed off that they'd made a political movie that was left-wing, and it equated wealthy people with fascism. Republican members of Congress complained about the film and the left-wing bias of it, and tried to get the Hayes office to ban the movie, which didn't happen. And basically, there was a great big media storm about this film because it actually said rich people are fascists, or rich people can be fascists, and rich people who had also bankrolled people like Hitler were the problem, not the solution to America's ills. So I enjoy the movie. It's very melodramatic. It's got some good actors in it. They did a few things right. They did things like showing journalists actually doing journalism, writing down, typing out their stories and things like that, getting the information, doing the research, doing the investigation, all that stuff that is the nuts and bolts of being a journalist gets shown in this movie. It's an important film. It talks to abuses of power and how the cult of personality is not a good way for any democracy to operate. Keeper of the Flame isn't remembered as a Tracy and Hepburn movie, but this one's the important one for me. This one was one of the important ones. This one says all of the things that have come to pass in the last 10 years in America. And that's kind of prophetic for a movie that's 80 years old. So I watched that and I enjoyed it. It's a hidden gem of 1940s American political cinema. And if you haven't seen Keeper of the Flame, maybe you should check it out. It's got a lot to say there. It doesn't entirely land the ending, but it's good enough to be worth checking out and just finding something that's a bit interstitial and not mainstream, well-known American cinema of the time. So that's the third movie I've got for you there. Then we hit Heretic. I went to see Heretic at the Sun Cinema in Yarraville. It was a beautiful day. Had a banh mi, had a drink, sat around in the sunshine for a while, which was wonderful, and then went and saw the movie, which I got to see in the La Scala Cinema, which is one of my favourite of the little boutique cinemas at this Sun in Yarraville. And it's cool. It's a good movie. In it, you've got Mr. Reed, played by Hugh Grant, who's an older gentleman who gets door-knocked by a couple of Mormon missionaries, played by Sophie Thatcher and Chloe East, both of whom the actresses were raised Mormon, so they were very ingrained in the Mormon culture. One of them has since left the church, but grew up in the church. Now, Sister Barnes and Sister Paxton are kind of shy. They have a little conversation before they go off to visit Mr. Reed in his secluded cottage on the edge of a cliff. And just as they get there, it starts raining really heavily. And Mr. Reed answers the door and he's charming and polite to them, invites them in, but they say, no, we can't be in your house unless there's a woman present. And he says, does my wife count? She's making blueberry pie. And they can smell the blueberry pie. So they come in and wait in the living room while he goes off and does stuff in the back room. And then he comes back and starts talking to them about religion. He's got an enormous Book of Mormon with tons of notes in it. And they start talking about comparative religions.
Well, ladies, I think it is time.
Time for what?
Time for enlightenment.
And he starts steering the conversation towards challenging their beliefs and challenging the way they see the world. And he does some unusual things, like gets various versions and iterations of the game Monopoly and puts them on the table and suggests to these two Mormon missionaries who are quite young that religion is iterative. All of the things that are in Christianity, all the things that are in Mormon belief systems, existed in previous iterations in much older religions, and that we keep rewriting theology into each different era for mostly political and personal reasons. He challenges the polygamy of early Mormonism and suggests that the reason Brigham Young and other people had multiple wives was to rationalize their adultery and their lust. The two young missionaries are a bit taken aback by that, and then things go darker. And he has 2 doors leading further into the house.
Scary.
And he writes belief and disbelief on each of them and asks them to pick a door to leave the house because the front door's got a lock, which is on a time lock. He can't change it. It was something that was with the house when he got it, blah, blah, blah. And so he leads them down a dark pathway and it becomes increasingly a horror film. He shows them what he says is a miracle of God, but it turns out it isn't. And slowly it gets darker and darker and nastier as the genial but dangerous Mr. Reed talks to these 2 young women and manipulates them with very practiced skills of manipulation further into the house. Hugh Grant's had such a good career over the last 10 years. I mean, he's done some fantastic things. I loved him in Operation Fortune Rudiger, playing a weird arms dealer. He was fantastic in Paddington 2, playing an over-the-top egotistical actor called Phoenix Buchanan. Very theatrical, very flamboyant in that. And in this, he uses the persona of Hugh Grant, the kind of genial, friendly, slightly quirky and eccentric persona, to a much darker purpose. It really works. Hugh Grant's career has taken a pivot that nobody watching Love Actually or any of those other movies where he played a kind of slightly stammering, charming, but inept leading man could have predicted. This is a fun movie. And one of the interesting things about it is the script is fantastically written. And it was written and directed by Scott Beck and Brian Woods. It's an intelligent script which challenges religion in some ways. I mean, one of the things that makes Mr. Reed such an interesting character is he's entirely right, but he's entirely wrong. He's entirely right in that people make up religions and people change them for their own purposes. And religion's the only business in the world that sells you a product that could never prove exists. That kind of stuff. So from that point of view, Reed is right. Religion is whack. Religion is an accumulation of myths that have been sold to people as the truth. But he's also wrong in the way he applies it and the way he turns evangelism 180 degrees to try to convince people that he's right, because he doesn't really want to convince people he's right. He has another motive. He has another reason for doing what he's doing. And that makes it a really interesting film. And Hugh Grant is note perfect playing that character. Sophie Thatcher and Chloe East are good as the other roles. Scott Beck and Brian Woods wanted actresses who had been Mormons to play those roles because they knew they would bring much more to those roles than could be just written into the script. They would have lived experience that could be used. And the Mormon missionaries had been raised to be polite under every circumstance. And even when challenged and at times threatened, they're maintaining that imposed politeness in the way they respond to Mr. Reed. And that makes it an interesting duality. On one side, you've got Reed, charming, intellectual, forceful, and these 2 socially naive young women trying to find ways to challenge him while not being rude to him. There's an incredibly interesting dynamic in those interactions. Toward the end, the movie does become somewhat of a more mainstreamy horror movie, but the lead up really makes it work. The way that Mr. Reed has his pre-planned TED Talk, and thanks to Graham Watson for calling it a TED Talk in his review of the movie. It's a really interesting intellectual movie as much as it is a horror film. The ending lands well, and I'm not going to do any spoilers beyond what I've already told you, which is pretty much most of what's in the trailer. But Heretic's a good horror film, and horror is having such a good era at the moment. There are so many good hooks upon which to hang a horror movie these days. And this one has enough that's different. And it walks a fine line, particularly to an American audience. There are so many people who are inside that bubble of religion that they would find this movie even more challenging than other people would. It's a good little horror film. Not a large budget, but it lands well. It stays true to its premise, and it delivers that premise well until it needs to become a horror film, and then it becomes a horror film. So it's a recommend from me. I enjoyed it a lot. I like movies that are intellectually adept and don't just settle for status quo examinations of American society. It works. And the way that the changing weather outside becomes a part of the escalation in the movie is really interesting as well. Nice little film. I'm not sure it's going to do fantastically well at the box office. I think it should. I think it'll do well when it comes to streaming in physical media, and I will get a Blu-ray of it. So if you've seen Heretic, let me know what you think of it. If you've seen these other movies, let me know what you think of them as well. It's been an interesting week for movie watching for me, and then I've got a really challenging week next week where I've got to review and watch a whole bunch of Umbrella new releases, which are very unusual and quirky. So that's what I got for you this time around. 4 movies incredibly different from each other, but all of them each in their own way somewhat challenging. Thanks a lot for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, hit the notification bell. You can support the channel by becoming a channel member or by becoming a patron at patreon.com/TerryTalksMovies. I've just uploaded a new driving vlog for the Patreon supporters. That's not going to hit the main channel for a couple of weeks yet. Also for the channel members. And I'm doing a couple of other things for the channel members and the Patreon supporters as we roll into the end of year. Next up, of course, we've got the Wednesday video, which is going to be the Umbrella releases for December, which are really good. Then we've got Science Fiction Saturday again. Before the end of the year, I am going to do a 24-hour movie marathon. And because of various medications I've got to take and things like that, I'm splitting it into 2 12-hour movie sessions over 2 days in a row. So together they'll be 24 hours. But because of my medical needs, I'm going to be splitting them into 2 days. And I'm looking forward to doing that because I've got a way of randomizing the selection of those videos, which is going to be a lot of fun. So tons of stuff before the end of the year. Then New Year's Eve, I'm doing my live stream between 11 p.m. and 1 a.m. local time over New Year's Eve. Tons of good stuff on our channel. Going to enjoy the end of 2024 and the beginning of 2025. And to hell with politics. So until all of that stuff happens, watch some good movies and watch some bad movies. Get some Hugh Grant in here, and I'll catch you next time.